Welcome back to your podcast, True Fraud. We're here with Vinay Shiriwastaw from DisputeHelp, and we're very happy to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming out. Today we're going to talk about kind of like the bigger umbrella of chargebacks, the new products that are coming up in the market, how they're affecting the environment, the payment environment, and how we can leverage it. Yeah, why don't we start with kind of like a basic question. What are chargebacks? Where they come from? What's their origin?
Sure.
How do they affect the payment environment?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about a chargeback, really it's a mechanism that was built and designed to protect the consumer, somebody buying a good or service, and it harkens back to really when the establishment of the credit card industry came about. And that happened in the 1960s, where, Bank of America, as you know, which is now Visa, issued the first credit card where they deemed somebody creditworthy and put value on a card. And as soon as that happens, by the natural state of human beings, two things happen. Abuse.
Of course.
And abuse happens on the consumer side, where other people are now stealing your card, your identity, and then using your line of credit for their malicious acts. And on the merchant side, you are trying to get over on a consumer. You might sell a good or service that is not how it was depicted. Its quality wasn't what was said. It was malfunctioning. So really, chargebacks stemmed from the Fair Credit Act of 1974, which put in place protection for consumers. And those protections, as I said, were predominantly designed to do two things. Protect the consumer from fraud, somebody stealing your card and using it. And then number two, protect the consumer on the merchant side. If a merchant didn't deliver a good or service as was rendered to the consumer, then the chargeback allowed for the freezing of those funds to go back to the consumer, and a process to take place in which parties would try to mitigate and figure out who is in the right for that dispute or chargeback.
Yeah, it's very interesting to think how things have evolved, but then some things basically remain the same, right? There's always a kind of the abuse part of the system, the ecosystem. And then there's the part of, now there are so many other security checks, and there's so many other, policies around like the protection for the cardholders. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about that progression? So we had chargebacks, and then what happened after that? How there's got to be another way that right now the payment industry is protecting not only merchants, but also the cardholders.
Mm-hmm. One of the key things that we should discuss is along these lines, and this is getting a little advanced, but how did a process designed to protect the consumer become a situation where now the consumer is abusing that process? And when you have fraud, you have, right, non-delivery of goods. But what is rampant now is friendly fraud, in which a process designed to protect a consumer is now being used to actually hurt the merchant ecosystem,
Mm-hmm.
in which somebody knowingly has bought a good or service, or their household has knowingly bought a good or service, but you're using the chargeback guidelines to say, I didn't do that transaction, or something wasn't delivered, when indeed it was fulfilled by the merchant. And that, essentially friendly fraud is now 60 to 70% of the chargebacks, right, that happen. And so it harkens back to what I just said, is how does a system designed to protect the consumer become such a thing in our world today? To your point, what was the progression that now it actually is abused by the consumer to a degree? It does protect the consumer still. Let's not take away from that, but it is an abusive practice today. And so when you look at the players in the chargeback ecosystem, right, you have multiple players. So we quickly will examine that, but you have the consumer, the cardholder. You have the issuing bank, the bank that issues the card to the consumer. You have the merchant, of course, where the goods and services are bought. You have the acquiring processor, the merchant acquirer, right? And across those processes, a chargeback is issued by the consumer. The issuing bank will examine that and see if it's valid to send. They'll send it to the card schemes. The card schemes will send it to the acquiring bank, and the acquiring bank will then send it to the merchant. All the while, if it's a valid chargeback, as seen by the issuing bank, the funds are frozen, taken away from the merchant, and placed in limbo. Mm-hmm. And then that whole cycle goes the other way. Then the merchant will put together compelling evidence and send it to the acquiring processor. The acquiring processor will see if this is good enough to send. They'll send it through to the card schemes, to the issuing bank. The acquiring processor will make a recommendation, but the issuing bank really has the final say on where that liability sits, and they'll determine, is my consumer correct or is the merchant correct? And then the funds will be moved accordingly based on that decision-making process.
You said something critical there, where the part of the issuer makes the decision.
Yes.
There's this misconception that I run into a lot with people, where they think that when you file a dispute, it never hits the merchant. Like me as a consumer, if I file a chargeback, I always think that the card schemes are going to absorb that loss. Mm-hmm. But it always goes back to that merchant. And then on the other side, if you were a merchant, then there's a lot of misconceptions, or maybe just, misunderstanding as to how that flow works. And they think that somebody else is making the decision, maybe the acquirer or the payment facilitator is making the decision as to who is going to win that dispute. Mm-hmm. And it always goes back to the issuer. Correct. Right? Yeah. I think that's a very, important point of information that we should note, that it's always the issuer who makes the decision. So what are, we're talking about the kind of that representative flow. What are some of the flaws that you see nowadays with that whole process? Because that seems like there's a lot of middle people in that flow.
Well, I would say the flaws in the process is what we just examined. If you think about how many players we just talked about, this is a very static process, and it's a very regimented process. And it's going from one cycle to one cycle to one cycle to one cycle. And it's not very fast if you think about what we just talked about. The inherent problem, right, in my opinion, is it's humans making these decisions. And it has to be that way, because this is the representment. It's not technology making these decisions. It's humans making these decisions. And a human is looking at compelling evidence as put together by the merchant and sent over through many means, and is now sitting on the issuer, and then a human being is looking at that and making a determination who's right. That's tough. Have you put it together enough compelling evidence? It's received as PDF static, right? It's not today's date. It's still not a video file or something like that, or any real-time processes. So people make errors. And it's subjective, mm-hmm. and that's problematic. And number two, I would say that if we just talked about what we just talked about, how costly is that, right? The unit economics for everybody in that, or not everybody, but a lot of those players, the issuer, the acquiring processor, and particularly the merchant. What a severe impact to take time out of your day. I'm, producing movies to sell digitally. That's the business I'm in. And now I have to station people and have them understand a process that is really not what I'm in business for. Mm-hmm. There's a tremendous cost impact to a merchant. We deem it anywhere from, $20 to $70 to $100 to action a chargeback at the merchant side. That's a tremendous cost. Yeah. What if what you're selling is only $19 and you have man hours, people, a downward impact on your finances actioning a chargeback or representing it. So I think those are when you look at the big rocks, those are the inherent problems. And then there's not much you can do about it because the notification is coming later. So, there's not time to act as a merchant. You're waiting for this thing to happen. Then you're sending it back and you're waiting.
Mm-hmm.
And so that speed to action isn't there. And we're used to faster speeds as society now, obviously. So I think time, money, process, these are severe impacts of the representment channel that happens today.
I think there is this misconception, from a lot of, and I've heard this fairly often in the industry, where if I get ahead of the chargeback, or if I send the correct data for the representment and I win the chargeback doesn't count towards my monthly threshold, let's say. And I think, how often do you hear this still in the industry?
I think it's pretty common. I mean, I think you touched on something, pretty important, that it's an if-then statement that happens at the merchant level, right? If I do this and I do things properly, then I don't have a chargeback problem. Anytime for any reason code, and chargebacks are classified by reason code, anytime that chargeback fully happens at the consumer and issuer level and gets passed through the ecosystem we described, it is a chargeback. It is a chargeback going against acquire counts of chargebacks and going against merchant counts. And, merchants are required to maintain a balanced threshold of chargebacks. Very typically, the rule of thumb is the associations like a merchant to be under 1% of chargebacks, right? That's the number of chargebacks by number of transactions. So, typically they like merchants to be under 1%. So, even if a merchant does everything right on the representment side, that chargeback still is a chargeback. There's a particular file that it goes on and it counts against that merchant. The only way to head that off is to use one of these products. Yeah, this technology, right? These pre-chargeback alerts, consumer clarity, order insights, compelling evidence. These are tools that take away that chargeback. So these are things that when used properly and when used effectively, mitigate the chargeback and don't have that chargeback impact ultimately to the merchant.
Yeah, I think that's a very useful tool. Vinay, so you're talking about this representment process, that you're talking about the abuse that we're seeing with friendly fraud. So what comes after this? What are the tools, or how is one as a merchant or a consumer supposed to utilize what's available right now?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. We talked a lot about the history and a process that was built. The question is, since we're in a world of technology, what technology is being put forward to defend the merchant, continue to defend the consumer, and modernize a process that has traditionally not seen much modernization in a very long period of time? Love to talk about those things with you on the next one.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Look forward to it. Thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you so much for listening to our podcast, True Fraud. Again, my name is Pablo Torres, and this is Vinay Shiriwastaw.
Brought to you by the Reach Network. Visit withreach.com/network for more.